Fire, lightning, smoke, and ash. These are what have poured from the top of the erupting volcano, the wind carrying its expelled debris across the Jurassic forests and plains. In response, much of the local wildlife has fled from the tremors and ash clouds. Though most of it is pulled east, the whole area seems to have gone quiet, only broken by light rumblings and flashes of lightning. To the south of the volcano, there are no dinosaurs to be seen in the shadow of the erupting volcano, except for one unwilling straggler. Lying on the warm earth staring at the roiling ash clouds is a subadult Allosaurus. He wishes to distance himself from this place, however he is injured. A failed hunting attempt against a Stegosaurus left him with a large wound on his leg, when the herbivore impaled him with its tail spines. Though he is lucky to have gotten out of this situation alive, he has had to rest in order for his wound to heal. Only hours after his fight was when the volcano started to erupt, and despite his instincts telling him to move, his leg wouldn't allow him to, and so he has remained here for over a day. Now he is very hungry, but with his injury he has little chance of chasing down a meal. He'll have to rely on carrion if he has any hope of surviving. Now, having given his injury time to heal, and having done his best to keep it clean, the young predator feels it is time to move on, before this area gets more unsafe. As he stands, however, he senses he is being watched. He swivels his head around, scanning the area that he thought was empty. After a full 360-degree scan, he doesn't see anything. He is about to move on, when he catches a glimpse of something in the tree line. When he focuses properly, his keen eyes finally see what has been watching him. Staring from a gap in the trees is an adult female Ceratosaurus, almost perfectly hidden despite being over 2 meters tall. As soon as the predators lock eyes, she knows she has been spotted, and oddly begins to walk towards the Allosaurus. The subadult lets out a slow, low growl to intimidate the approaching carnivore, but she slowly moves towards him completely unaffected. This is highly unusual. Ceratosaurus always avoid Allosaurus for the simple reason that they are larger and more heavily built, a relationship similar to that of lions and leopards. But this female approaches him without fear, her eyes scanning him for weaknesses, and he does the same to her. Once she enters the clearing, the difference in them becomes clear. At 7 meters long and 1 ton, she is about as large as Ceratosaurus get, and though the Allosaurus is not fully grown, at 9 meters he is still larger and heavier than she is. Both have crests above their eyes, and the Ceratosaurus has one on her nose. However, these are for display, and no use in confrontation. The female's body is covered in hard osteoderms, which provide slightly better protection than her opponent's thick hide. Their jaws are lined with serrated teeth for killing other dinosaurs, but the Allosaurus has long claws on his relatively strong arms, while the smaller Ceratosaurus's arms are next to useless. The only thing the Ceratosaurus has on her opponent is that she is uninjured, and she is experienced enough to take advantage of this. The two predators size each other up and begin to circle. The Allosaurus hisses and the Ceratosaurus growls in response. The Allosaurus is confused by this individual's behavior. She didn't just come across him, she had to have tracked him in amongst this abandoned forest. There was something in the way she moved, the way she looked at him. She wasn't here by chance. She was here for a reason. They both knew what was about to happen, and now the Ceratosaurus drew a deep breath and let out a vicious, reverberating roar. The Allosaurus responded with a defiant roar of his own, and despite his leg injury, charged forward. Closing their gap quickly, he bit down towards the smaller dinosaur's neck, but his target stepped backwards as he chomped down on empty air. The Ceratosaurus lurched forward and bit down on the Allosaurus's closed jaws, her long teeth cutting into the front part of his skull. The Allosaurus groaned in pain and tried to open his jaws, but the female had him secured. He stepped back and pulled his head up. Though her teeth sunk deeper, he was able to bring his claws forward and slash across his opponent's chest. She released him and tried to bite at his head again, but he pulled his head off to the side and then swung it violently against her own, forcing her to stagger across the ground. She held her footing, but before she could counter, the Allosaurus was on her and brought his jaws down on her back. She roared and tried to bite at him, but the Allosaurus held her in place, his teeth digging into some parts of her flesh, but unable to cut through the arm and osteoderms in others. Now with a good hold, the powerful predator began to lift his victim up. He couldn't lift her clean off the ground, but he was bearing an astonishing amount of weight nonetheless. He then crashed her downwards, buckling her knees with the first thrust, and then with the second, pinning her to the ground. Still roaring in anger, the Ceratosaurus snapped at her attacker, who now let go of his jaws and placed one foot on the grounded predator's skull, attempting to crush her under his weight. As he did this, the female used both her legs and delivered a powerful dual kick that shoved the Allosaurus off her and tumbled him backwards till he hit a tree. Getting to her feet as quickly as possible, the Ceratosaurus had to dodge to the side as the angry Allosaurus charged her with its mouth wide open. He crashed through a dead tree, but spun around and charged again. She maneuvered out of the way, but this time used the horn above her eye and bashed it into the wound on the Allosaurus's thigh. Searing pain ripped through the Allosaurus's leg, causing him to let out a squealing howl. The Ceratosaurus took a chance and bit down on the Allosaurus's neck, forcing him backwards till they both slammed against a tree that nearly broke under the combined weight of the two titans. The Allosaurus righted himself and shook himself, trying to struggle free from the smaller predator's grip. Eventually it worked, and the Allosaurus was free. Now he swung wide with his right arm, but the Ceratosaurus ducked under the long claws and went in for another bite. But then the Allosaurus's other arm came around, and one of his claws slashed across the female's face. The sharp, curved claw cut deep into her flesh and carved out a single straight gash from the tip of her snout, under her eye, to the back of her jaw. She reeled back in pain as blood poured down her face and into her mouth, causing her left eye to go foggy. Before the Allosaurus could follow up, an explosion burst from the top of the volcano, sending a blast wave in all directions. It struck the two dinosaurs with such force, both of them stumbled across the ground, but neither fell. The Allosaurus shook his head to clear the ringing out of his ears. But when he looked up, the Ceratosaurus was charging him, with its head held low. She slammed her head right into the larger predator's chest. The Allosaurus was thrown backwards, and he felt some of his ribs crack from the impact. The Allosaurus planted both feet and twisted his body, bringing his tail around and smashing it across the bleeding female's skull. With such force it sent her to the ground. With only one eye seeing clearly, and her head dazed from the tail swing, the Ceratosaurus struggled to get up. And now, standing above her, the Allosaurus opened his jaws to its maximum gape, and brought it down like a falling axe. The blow hit the female's back, and she roared in pain. The Allosaurus lifted his head again, and brought it down on her neck, causing her to cry out even louder. Finally, the male put one foot on her back, pinning her to the ground, and let out a blood-curdling roar directly into the female's face, covering her in spittle. A second blast wave from the volcano burst outwards, knocking the Allosaurus backwards, forcing him off the exhausted Ceratosaurus. The Allosaurus looked around and noticed that in the distance a small fire had started, and it would soon reach this area. Looking down at the prone Ceratosaurus, he could see she was breathing heavily and struggling to move. She had no fight left, and finishing her off wouldn't be worth it, especially with a fire incoming. He turned and began to move away, now with even more injuries. He needed to find food and water fast. Laying on the ground, the Ceratosaurus struggled to breathe. Her body hurt all over, and she could smell the incoming smoke. With what little energy she had left, she twisted her head to look at the retreating Allosaurus, and then suddenly, she remembered. She remembered being in this position before. She remembered the feelings of helplessness in the presence of an Allosaurus, and she remembered the screams. The screams as she watched her hatchlings being eaten alive in front of her. And she remembered the rage. The Allosaurus heard something behind him and turned his head backwards. To his shock, the Ceratosaurus was standing up, but this time there was something different. A look in her eyes that made even the apex predator feel something akin to dread. It was clear now she wasn't going to stop. Very well. If he had to kill her, at least then he would have a quick meal. She was still getting her bearings and breathing heavily, so the Allosaurus rushed her, lifting himself up to bring his right arm down and slash her with his claws. At the last moment, the Ceratosaurus's head swung upwards, and she bit off 2 of the 3 claws clean from the rest of the Allosaurus's arm. She spat out the long fingers just in time to see the Allosaurus's other arm swing for her. This time, she lurched forward and caught the arm just above the elbow in her jaws. She then took 1 step back and with all her strength pulled her head and body downwards, ripping the entire arm clean from the socket, sending blood spraying from the massive open wound. The Allosaurus squealed as the most extreme pain he had ever experienced coursed through his body. As he writhed in pain, the Ceratosaurus dropped the severed arm and swung her tail around, smashing it across the Allosaurus's skull, causing him to topple over the edge of a hill. He rolled down the incline, feeling bones crack and muscles pull. Finally, he came to a stop when he crashed into a rock, knocking the air from his lungs. As he gasped for air, the male peered upwards and saw the Ceratosaurus running down the hill before she leapt into the air and brought her whole body weight crashing down, impacting both legs right into the Allosaurus's ribs, breaking them under 1 ton of rage-filled ferocity. The Allosaurus could barely manage to breathe, let alone roar, as he watched the female pull herself off him, and without hesitation clamp her jaws around his neck, her long teeth cutting through his tough hide and severing the jugular. The Allosaurus kicked back, but it was useless. The Ceratosaurus thrashed ahead, back and forth, her teeth cutting deeper and deeper, until finally, after his greatest struggle, the Allosaurus stopped moving and lay dead, his body bearing the scars of over a dozen previous injuries, his final moments a testament to the violent life of an apex predator. The female Ceratosaurus released her blood-soaked jaws, took a deep breath, and roared into the sky. Lightning struck to the east, and fire burnt to the west. But above it all rang the sound of a victorious, vengeful hunter that had taken down her arch-enemy and avenged her long-dead offspring. She lowered her head and drew deep breaths. This had been the fight of her life, and though she would survive, she would bear the scars for the rest of her days, especially the large facial scar that many dinosaurs would learn to fear. She had killed her only competition in this region, and was now the top predator of these lands. The Ceratosaurus kingdom had been claimed, and she was its master, the scar-faced queen of the Jurassic.